Hi, everyone. My name is Gwen. Pronoun she, they. I am a first year student or second year student actually in the sociology PhD program. I do also want to start off by saying I'm having severe allergies right now. So if I sound a little bit weird, this is why. Or if I'm talking really slow, this is why. So just please be patient with me. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. Thanks everyone for being here. So my project, this is largely based on my master's thesis that I am working on currently. So I entitled this presentation, Healing Together Towards a Relational Self-Care. So in the days following the 2016 presidential election, internet searches for self-care rose exponentially. Since then, the term has become ubiquitous. Self-care typically refers to how one cares for their own physical, emotional, spiritual, and financial well-being. Care is now at the forefront of people's minds, but feminists have long been interested in care. As social problems continue to multiply in the context of a global pandemic, the study of care and its many manifestations has become ever more urgent. In 1987, feminist activist Audre Lorde wrote, "Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare." Other feminists have also linked self-care to political resistance and social transformation. On the other hand, self-care has been criticized in popular media for being a market-driven solution to social problems. Sociologists have found that this is the case in the self-help industry as individuals feel a lack of agency. They turn towards self-together, and that specifically refer to themselves as self-care groups or as groups where they recognize that self-care is vital for either revolution or for like community organizing, for activism, stuff of that nature. So from my observations, I gather that self-care typically refers to 4 different arenas, and that's people's physical self, their emotional self, their spiritual self, and increasingly their financial self. And all this ties into like all 4 of those arenas within their well-being. But I think in order to properly assess what this even means and why people even care about these arenas, we must treat each of them as foreign and question what is given. So well-being has actually classically been seen as property of the collective rather than the individual, a common good engendered through the right ordering of relationships at the societal level. So institutions across the country are including well-being programs in their benefits packages, and many workplaces offer self-care and wellness tips and workshops, including UT Austin. So I'm noticing here that something is shifting. However, I wanted to know particularly that I'm not sure if people are familiar with like Tricia Hersey of this organization called the NAP Ministry, but she believes that sleep has been taken from us as a collective and that rest is reparations for Black people. And I saw her speak at a Google event, which I found really interesting. And so this kind of like my wheels started turning and I started thinking about like, what can we make of something like the NAP Ministry speaking at Google, particularly in connections to understanding that well-being is something that is collectively shared, not just individually held. And what does this mean for these types of like knowledges and standpoints? Like why now is Google reaching out to Tricia Hersey to speak to them and their employees and everyone? So this leads me to 3 strands of this politicized progressive self-care that I have observed as guiding frameworks for each of the groups that I've observed. So the first is a Black feminist understanding of care, caretaking, and healing. This ties a lot with like, again, NAP Ministry, this like really push towards rest. It ties a lot with like the beginnings of it, dating back to Audre Lorde, and then also something called healing justice, which is definitely tied in like Black Southern folk medicine. The second is a political approach that aims to transform democracy and social understandings of care. This belief is that care needs to be democratized because only a few people are able to access it, whether that be self-care or paid care, all the different ways that care is kind of distributed around our society. And then the third framework is one that is rooted in disability justice. So I picked up these frameworks after recognizing how group leaders describe their mission, how they led their sessions, the goals for the people that joined the group, like why they even wanted to be in the groups, and the ways in which our conversations flowed. Um, so I looked at a variety of groups during my time doing field work. Most notably, I've been involved in reading groups on self care, organizing groups of sessions on self care, wellness collectives, groups of healers, healing justice organizers, and self care groups for spirituality and decolonization. Although the groups vary in their intention and in who leads them, they have shared norms in their spaces and shared modes of thought. Almost every meeting kind of like starts in the same way. There's always a land acknowledgement. There is generally like check in emotionally. And then from there, we go into the main session. But something that I also find it interesting is that there is like definitely a focus on embodiment in the body. Sometimes in these meetings, we just like nap together on Zoom for like 20 minutes, which to me seems really fun. And there's no one else doing that kind of stuff. So I really like it in that regard. So I do want to make a note that I am in some ways grateful for doing this study virtually. I think it really goes to show that people want to be with one another, even if under the umbrella of a supposedly individualistic exercise of self care. Also, so much happened within the past year. I mean, things are constantly happening, but I was able to see how people reacted to uprisings, protests, various traumas, acts of violence, and the 2020 presidential election, because my field work has kind of like gone. I mean, I was just at an event like this past weekend, so I've been doing things this entire time. And these events were always touched on and discussed. So I'm thankful that I was able to see how people are responding to these things. Additionally, I was able to participate in groups all over the country in New York City, in Detroit, Michigan, in South Carolina, in Georgia, and in California. Like me, many of the participants in the groups came from outside the immediate area. So it seems like this is something I don't know if it necessarily will go away post the pandemic, but it seems like something that is very particular to this time, at least in the ways that we're meeting. But yeah, people want to connect and they want to feel cared for. The demographics of these groups are mostly women, non-binary people, and gender non-conforming individuals. Very rarely did I meet a man in these spaces. People range from very young, late teens, early 20s, to quite elderly in their 70s and 80s. And people typically identified as Black, Indigenous, Latin, South Asian, or white. But this is not to say that I've captured everyone who's a part of these groups, nor that these categories are in any way exhaustive. In and of themselves. So leaders of these groups tend to be healers, yoga practitioners, activists, former organizers, religious and spiritual leaders, and therapists and counselors. The members of these groups vary. Some are mothers that just feel tired and burnt out. There was like randomly some influencers in the mix that wanted to join. Others have been doing community organizing for decades. And some, like me, were PhD students. Um, and I mean, I will say that after spending time in each of these groups, I definitely did feel cared for and I felt happy. There was rarely a time when, I mean, just like any sort of job, you kind of dread going to it. And then, I mean, each and every time I felt so much better. So there definitely is something to like what we're actually doing in these practices. So, so here are some findings that I think, some preliminary, of course, that I think are happening within these groups. So the first is that there's an internal component of social change that is flourishing in these groups. There's a recognition that we have internalized many things like productivity, internalized capitalism, internalized colonialism. And this is a way that we're able to counter them. Whether that be rest, slowing down, treating ourselves with kindness, treating others with kindness, relating to one another. This is like one of the forms in which like we can kind of get rid of those internalizations. One thing I wanted to know also is there's like absolutely no talk of productivity in any of these spaces. I think if anyone were to bring it up, it'd be like, absolutely, that's just like not the mood here. And I think even within, like, I remember a specific group that I was visiting with, um, we were discussing how, like, even within like activists and organizing spaces, there is such a push to like do stuff immediately, and things has to get done like right then and now, and how that ends up being particularly toxic towards women within those spaces. And just kind of reframing the ways in which it's almost like a different relationship with time. I'm noticing from that sort of thing where it's like, okay, not only do we have to rid ourselves of these internalizations, but things have to happen on our own terms, not necessarily the terms of the society that we live in or the other groups that we're involved in. So I think that's fascinating. To this point, um, a lot of the ways that our work within these groups is framed is through caring to heal. There's an intersection of therapeutic culture here that is, of course, visible explicitly through the support group type setting. But healing is explicitly political in this case because, as one participant once told me, oppression is a wound. So there is another part of the internalization of what needs to happen for us to be able to relate to one another. The second is that survival practices are taught and shared. So not only is this a way of sustaining life and just generally surviving and getting through it, but there's also an underbelly of political education. So this is not only are these survivalist tactics tied to like just politics, and named as political, but we also generally do go in, we talk history, we like talk about like previous political movements. So there definitely is like a political education, um, kind of component of these groups, which I think is very interesting. And the survival strategies, I feel like I haven't really gone into them, but a lot of it is like groundings, like, meeting immediate needs, like kind of mutual aid, like connecting people via mutual aid also. Just thinking back at like traditions that people have, meditation, different forms of like rituals that we all do together. And that serves as these survival and healing strategies. The third is that many of the group leaders draw upon ancient forms of wisdom and healing. They draw from ancestral knowledge and from nature and the earth. So I was at a meeting this weekend actually when a small group of us were talking about grief and what taught us how to grieve. And one participant noted that she learned how to mourn through experience, through what she described as an internal knowing that feels bigger than her. And she classified this as her ancestors guiding her. And she also noted that social rituals have taught her how to grieve as well, because this is a communal practice, not strictly internal. So this was very interesting to me because, you know, I I think that there's like a lot of ways in which there's a connection between like not or growing connection that I'm seeing in the ways in which we relate to our ancestors, our heritage, those that are not with us anymore, and these like narratives that we tell ourselves and stories that we tell ourselves and just knowledges that we bring to help us all survive in the current moment, which I think is fascinating as well. So overall, these findings suggest that while there is an internal component to being with one another that must be nurtured, relationality is key to recognizing what an individual needs. Also, as many of the participants know, this is not new. Many people have told me that this is all ancient knowledge. We didn't invent anything. This is how many of us got here, and what kind of work. Uh, I guess this also kind of makes me think about what kind of work makes it possible to sustain life. And I believe that this really opens up possibilities for the examination of individual actors and networks in social change that is not based in rationality, or rational choice theory, which is like a really big thing in sociology, but rather I hope that this project can provide a historical and contextual study of not only why self care, but also in what ways these modes of sustaining life have been overlooked or erased, both currently and in the past. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Thanks, everyone.